Margaret was 58 years old when it was felt by first time really alone. It wasn't loneliness physics, but the one that is installed in he chest when he last pillar that supports a life disappears. Her husband there was deceased 2 months ago, and with him, it seemed to have been gone everything that was given meaning to his days. His daughter, Amanda, was his only family, and for that, when decided to sell the house where raised his family and moved in with Amanda and her husband Chad, did it, with him heart open, thinking that would be it, his shelter. At first, everything it seemed in calm, but it didn't take long and perceive he growing ice in the Chad's gestures. He didn't say anything direct, but each comment was a dart. Amanda, absent emotionally, she did not intervene. Margaret swallowed each contempt as who chew crystals, in silence. Before continuing, we ask for something important. Subscribe to the channel, so can continue bringing stories, real ones that deserve to be told. The night that changed all began as many others. One dinner tense, dishes served with distance, glances avoided. Margaret had prepared his famous stew, but Chad pushed it away without touching it. Amanda was just playing with its fork. When he finished, Chad stood up, crossed his arms, and without looking at her directly, he said, "He no longer has sense that you continue here." Amanda didn't say a word. Margaret felt that the ground was breaking beneath his feet. He did not scream. He did not ask explanations. He just nodded with a knot in the throat, climbed to his room and packed what he could in 2 suitcases. That same one night, with its dignity broken and red-eyed, she walked to a cheap motel about blocks, aimlessly, without a plan, only with the certainty that she was no longer welcome in the only place that I considered home. The motel room had a musty, damp and lonely smell. Margaret sat on the edge of the bed, with trembling hands. The television blinked with news he didn't care about, and a lamp flame projected moving shadows as ghosts. It happened the first days without knowing what to do. He fed on whatever he found in a nearby store: sliced bread, a can of soup, some instant coffee. There was something deeply humiliating in that fall. A woman who had sustained a family during decades, reduced now to tell coins to pay an evening more. Going through his things a night, looking for some comfort, found a box old with photos, letters and a notebook that he immediately recognized. The diary of his deceased mother toward more than 30 years. Opened he diary without waiting a lot, just to feel accompanied by the words of the one who raised her. But what she found among those pages was a bomb carefully buried. Her mother spoke with a tone hurt but firm, from a man named Harold Sterling. He said that he was the love of his life, but never recognized Margaret as daughter. That there was been a tough decision, but necessary, because he had other life, another family, and a surname too much heavy for one little girl, illegitimate. At the end of the diary, between pages already faded, Margaret found an envelope with a dated letter in 1978. It was from Harold. The letter began with, "To my daughter, whom never could embrace," and continued with a confession. He always knew about his existence, but they had forbidden approach. Inside the envelope, there was also a document from a fund trustee to his name. Margaret didn't know still, but that night not only found his origin, but also the key to its future. T moved this revelation, then subscribed to the channel. There's more. Stories that deserve a place in your heart. The background trustee was not a scandalous fortune, but yes, enough to rise from the abyss. Margaret spent the following weeks investigating from the same motel. Who was Harold Sterling? What there was been of his company? And how could reclaim what was his? He discovered that he there was dead toward 5 years, and that despite its multiple heirs officers, there were left instructions clear that one part of his heritage I had to go to an unrecognized daughter, whose existence only consisted in an annex confidential of your will. Margaret contacted him law firm indicated in the letter. After several days of doubts, verifications and paperwork, the money was transferred. It was then when she knew he shouldn't stay still. It wasn't just about surviving, it was time to learn, to understand, to build. She moved to Dallas, rented an apartment modest but worthy, and enrolled in a course, Basic Finance. A few months later, Margaret was already dominated terms that were previously others, assets, dividends, funds indexed. Started to invest with caution, advised by an accountant young man who took him darling. It also changed his aspect. Left. She threw back the sad clothes of mourning and discovered a renewed taste by the color, not to attract attention, but as a gesture intimate of respect by same. Every step she took her further away from the woman fragile that there was packed 2 suitcases crying. It felt strong, and when one day, drinking coffee in a terrace in downtown Dallas, saw by coincidence an advertisement real estate with the building name where Amanda and Chad lived, something inside her ignited. It wasn't rage, it wasn't revenge. It was an opportunity, a door that opened by itself. Margaret made a call, asked a meeting, and began to move the pieces of a game that by first time I understood. He bought the undisclosed building his identity. He did it through an investment company with a name neutral, one of those that do not attract attention, but they move millions. When he signed the deed, he clearly remembered the night where Amanda and Chad kicked her out. The hallway, the silence, the slammed door. I wasn't looking for it revenge, but justice. As soon as the transaction was closed, Margaret met with the property manager and asked an update of the contracts. It rose all the rentals in a manner uniform, protected in the current market, but made sure that Amanda and Chad's was slightly higher, not so much as to be scandalous, but yes, enough for them to start feeling he change. The first Amanda's calls came in weeks after, messages terse, empty, asking it was okay, that I missed her, that I wanted her talk. Margaret didn't answer, not because she didn't want to, but because I understood that it was not him moment. I knew Amanda was acting from fear, not from love, that life was pushing to wake up. Like to I had it myself, obliged he abandonment. Meanwhile, Chad began to suspect. He became obsessed with the rising rent, with the new terms of the contract, with the company owner. She started to do questions, to investigate, to move clumsily in a field he did not master. When he discovered the connection with Margaret, not directly, but through a lawyer who one day made a mistake when sending a document with his name, exploded in cholera. It was then when decided confront her. He came to his apartment in Dallas one gray afternoon, without warning. It was in the hand one folder with papers, and in the mouth a poorly constructed threat. Either he gave it to him part of the money, or would do public his history. What Chad didn't know was that Margaret had already, that movement was planned. Margaret greeted him with a serenity that unsettled Chad from the first minute. She didn't offer him coffee. She didn't invite him to sit down. She just opened the door, let him in, and listened his threats without interrupting him. When he finished speaking, he simply handed him an envelope closed. Chad opened it with shaking hands, waiting maybe an offer economic, but inside there was only a copy of the legal report that your equipment there was prepared. In it, the multiple demands by tax fraud and harassment labor that weighed about he and his ancient company, some of which already were in process. Margaret had investigated his life to the millimeter. "I'm not here to negotiate with you, Chad," he said firmly. "I'm here to remind you that I know to play." Chad, pale, left without saying one more word. That was the last time he saw it. Amanda, in change, began to appear with more frequency. First messages, then calls, then letters. He didn't ask for money, he asked time. Margaret was in no hurry in receive her. I understood that healing wasn't a matter of days, but one day Amanda showed up in front of his door, alone, with red eyes and a notebook under the arm. "I'm going to therapy," he said. I started painting, thinking, remembering, and I need ask you sorry, not for what happened, because I know that it is not enough, but for what I didn't do. Margaret looked at her for a long time. There was no hate in his eyes, just a tiredness old. He let her in, served her a cup of tea, and they sat down in silence. There were no hugs nor scenes emotional, just two women, wounded for the same history, trying to recognize each other without words. Amanda was left that night. I don't eat daughter searching shelter, but as women starting over. That was it, the first step towards something. Neither of them knew his name. During the weeks following, Amanda visited her mother frequently, sometimes spoke, others simply they shared his space in silence. Margaret was not looking for explanations, neither promises. Observed, measured each gesture with a mixture of prudence and hope. Amanda, by his part, spoke of his childhood, of memories blurred that suddenly returned with force. He spoke of fear, of dependence emotional, how there was vivid submitted to Chad's will without. Realizing its story, Margaret didn't interrupt her. Listening to her was like reading a book that was already new, but with pages that had been previously past overlooked. The resentment was gone fraying, replaced by a kind of compassion silent. There was no euphoria in that reconstruction. It was slow, rough, like putting together a broken vase without knowing if the pieces they fit together. One day, Amanda brought her a portrait she had painted. It was Margaret, sitting in a rocking chair with a book in the hands. The stroke was clumsy, but his gesture was true. "So tea memory when I was a child," she said. Margaret caressed the painting without saying anything. It was the first time he felt the pain begin to transform in other thing. No forgiveness, nor redemption. Something more subtle, a reunion with the image that Amanda had buried during years. In parallel, Margaret decided closer cycle, sold the building that was there, purchased in silence. I didn't need more that symbol of power. In his place, made a donation significant to a women's shelter mistreated. He baptized him with her mother's name, the Dolores Home. No one knew who was the donor. She didn't do missing. The important thing was that, for first time in a lot time, Margaret felt she was giving something back, something that I would have it myself brand years back. With the sale of the building, Margaret also closed other door, the need to prove something. I no longer felt the urgency for Amanda to understand everything there was lived, nor that the world knew where from permission his fortress there was left back he role of victim, but also that of heroine. She allowed herself to simply be a woman in reconstruction. With some of the remaining money, he bought a small house in a neighborhood quiet, not very far from the place where there was grown. The housing had a garden neglected, a porch with a hammock old, and one kitchen where entered the sun. In the morning, it was all she needed. Margaret moved out on her own, not because would reject Amanda's company, but because I knew that both needed spaces separated to heal. There was no reproach in that distance, only respect. The days passed with a routine almost therapeutic, sunrise walks, coffee in silence, visits occasional to a local bookstore. Sometimes Amanda would accompany her. Other times, she would leave letters at his mailbox with drawings or phrases short. Margaret read them with a smile discreet and kept them in a wooden box next to his mother's diary. There was started to write too. Not a diary as such, but fragments of thought. What I felt when I saw the bougainvilleas in the garden bloom. What I learned from living without fear. What I lost and what I found. Never. He imagined that at almost 60 years old, he would be beginning a life new, not like extension of the previous one, but as something completely different. I no longer expected apologies. I no longer asked space. He took it with the same softness with which he previously yielded it. And that difference, although small, I changed it all. One day, while reviewed ancient documents that they were saved by years without looking, Margaret found a photo in black and white of his mother at the entrance of an old grocery store. She was young, wearing a dress simple and smiling, as if life didn't weigh anything. On the back, written in ink already fainted, said, "Here began everything. Never forget who you are." Margaret stayed looking the image for a long time. That phrase resonated in its interior as a silent bell. It was a reminder of everything that had self, forgotten same. Her strength, his dignity, your right to exist without asking permission. He decided so, hang that photo in his living room new house, just in front of the armchair where I read each tomorrow. It was his anchor, your starting point. Life, since then, he turned simpler. Amanda started to accompany her in tasks, everyday tasks, cooking, watering the plants, even help her paint one of the walls of the house. They no longer spoke of the past with pain. They mentioned it as one speaks of an old scar, with respect, but without needing to touch it all the time. One day, while we're preparing grilled cheese sandwiches, a recipe that Margaret used dough when Amanda was a child, Amanda looked at her with different eyes. Never I thought we would have. It again, this, he said. Margaret didn't respond. It just happened to her. A cup of hot tea and smiled at her. It didn't make lack more. There was no speeches nor revelations, just a real moment, shared between two women who once they were lost and now they were reunited. So were the days now, without big gestures, but full of meaning. And for Margaret, that was more than enough. One autumn afternoon, Margaret received a letter from the law firm that had managed Harold Sterling's estate. I didn't expect news from them, so he opened it with a certain suspicion. For his surprise, it was an invitation. One of the foundations created for Sterling was organizing a tribute event to the sons and daughters of the businessman, including to those recognized post-mortem. At first, Margaret thought in ignore her. What sense had now? But something in his insides told him that he should go. Not for recognition, neither by belonging, but as an act, symbolic of closing a circle. Amanda encouraged her with a phrase that touched her deeply. Maybe it is not because he, but by you. So Margaret chose his dress blue sailor, the same one that used when signed the sale of the building, and went alone to the event. The living room was full of faces I didn't know, men and women dressed in suits expensive, talking about business and memories, relatives who were Margaret's strangers. However, it was not felt intimidated. She walked with a firm step to her assigned seat, greeting with a mild smile at those who watched her with curiosity. When they mentioned her in his speech, there was no details scandalous, just one phrase sober. Margaret was part of this history in a discreet way but essential, and that was everything. She didn't ask more. When he finished, a young man approached him, one of the Harold's grandchildren. He extended his hand and said, "I'm glad to meet you. My grandfather spoke of you with respect." Margaret thanked him without emotion, exaggerated. I didn't need to applause. That one night, while was returning home by taxi, he saw his reflection in the window, one woman who no longer carried the weight of abandonment, but the certainty calm to have recovered his place in her world. After the event, something in Margaret took hold. She didn't change his life in a visible form, but internally marked a before and after. It was no longer visible as a victim of the silence's strangers, nor as a woman forgotten by his own history. It was simply Margaret, with her past complete, its mistakes, its findings. That new certainty was reflected in the way he walked, the way he looked, even the way he answered the phone. His circle was small, but enough. Amanda, her accountant, a neighbor with whom exchanged books, and the owner of the bookstore where I spent the afternoons. I didn't need more. Sometimes received messages from ancient people acquaintances who had aware of your new life. Some congratulated her condescendingly, others with envy concealed. Margaret them read, smiled, and let it go. He learned that he shouldn't explain yourself to anyone. One Saturday in the morning, Amanda proposed something that Margaret had not expected, to organize a small exhibition of his paintings. Nothing ambitious, just an event. In the library community of the neighborhood. Margaret hesitated. "What if nobody, are you going?" he asked. Amanda responded with a smile. "So will be an exposure, private for me, and that's enough." They agreed a date, Margaret helped hang the paintings. He made lemonade homemade and prepared some cookies. On the day of the event, they came more people than they imagined. Neighborhood children, curious retirees, and even a local reporter who ended up writing a note with the title, "The Art of Starting Over, the Story of Amanda and Margaret." Reading it, Margaret didn't feel shame, neither pride. He felt true. And in that true simple, almost domestic, found something that life had denied during years: peace. It was no longer necessary gain, none battle, just live. And that was, at last, enough. As the months passed, Margaret and Amanda began to have small rituals that united them: preparing afternoon tea, reading in voice-high passages from books that moved them, or go out the Sundays at the local market. They didn't speak all the days of the past, but from time to time when a phrase slipped between the tomatoes or between sips of tea. "Never understood by what I was left with silent that night," Amanda said. "I neither understood by why didn't I know how to leave before," Margaret responded. They weren't reproaches, they were confessions light, shared from the complicity of those who they don't hurt themselves anymore. Amanda started to write too. Short stories, some about his childhood, others about women who were reborn in the midst of the disaster. Margaret. Them I read carefully, without judging. "You are better writing about what you were explaining to you," he used to tell her with a half smile. Amanda laughed, and so the afternoons passed, between memories and new ones' beginnings. One day, Margaret received a handwritten letter from a woman who lived in his shelter that he carried in name of his mother. He said that he had arrived there with fear, with a daughter small and self-esteem made shreds. That in the dining room of the place. Volunteer had told the story of such a Margaret, who one day was also kicked out of her house and ended up building other from scratch. "I don't know. Yeah, that Margaret is you," he wrote. "But thanks to she, now I dare to imagine a future different." Margaret kept that letter in his box of memories, along with his mother's diary and Amanda's letters. That night, as he went to bed, he thought how curious it was, the echo, a word that is thrown without knowing where will arrive. And sometimes it returns in the form of hope for someone further. That message was he push that Margaret needed to do something that was coming hanging around in his mind toward time. Count his history of manner open, not for fame purposes, neither recognition, but as tool. He met with a local journalist, the same one who had covered Amanda's exhibition, and accepted an interview. It was honest, without drama. She talked about her fall, from his passage through the motel, from his mother's diary, and from the day he realized he could start over without waiting permission from anyone. The interview was published under the title "A Life Rebuilt in the 60s. It was shared dozens of times on local networks, and soon Margaret began receiving messages from women unknown, some young people, others older, all with stories similar. "I didn't respond to all of them, but I read them with respect, like who listen a sacred confession." And he understood that his story, although personal, was not unique. A Friday in the afternoon, while Amanda was painting in her garden and Margaret watered the plants, sounded the bell. It was a young man of about 20-something, with a baby in arms. Hesitantly, he showed it to her, a printed copy of the interview. "Are you Margaret?" he asked. She nodded. The girl. He looked down and said, "I didn't come to ask you for anything. I just wanted to see her. Know that she's real." Margaret invited her in without further. No questions. He offered her water, made some toast, and listened in silence while the young woman counted his story. An abusive boyfriend, an unsupportive family, a flight recent with what was on. Amanda joined further late, without interruption. That night, the three they ate together. They didn't talk about solutions, magical, neither promises. They only shared the table, the bread, and a certainty that none said in voice high, that when a woman finds his voice can help to others not to lose theirs. From that meeting, Margaret began to receive further visits, some spontaneous, others agreed upon in advance. His house unwittingly became in a small, informal shelter. It didn't have a sign, nor schedule, nor structure. But those who they arrived, they knew that there would be a cup of tea, one free chair, and one woman willing to listen without judging. Amanda, at first, showed skeptical. "Don't you think you are exposing too much?" he asked. "At time." Margaret looked at her tenderly. "For years I hid waiting for someone came to rescue me. Now that I'm whole, I don't want hide more." With the time, Amanda understood that space he didn't take away from his mother, but rather completed her. Sometimes he joined in the conversations, other times painted, while I heard the laughter or the silences that were born in the kitchen. The house did not lose his peace. He just learned to share it. One of the moments, further significant, occurred a rainy night when an older woman, almost Margaret's age, arrived soaked with a broken suitcase and her eyes lost. She didn't say a lot, just that I came fleeing from a marriage that had removed until the I remember who she was. Margaret helped her dry off, lent her clothes and left them sleep in a sofa. In the morning, she made him coffee and showed him his mother's diary. Here I started to understand who was I, she told him. The woman cry in silence while he turned the pages. As he said goodbye, he left her a note. "Thanks for not asking anything. Thank you for be." Margaret kept that note with the others, and he thought that maybe that was his true legacy. Not the inheritance of an oil tycoon, nor justice silent against those who hurt her, but the invisible chain of dignity restored among women who, like she, decided not to disappear. Despite everything that had happened built, Margaret maintained a life. Simple. I rejected invitations to conferences or television programs. I didn't want to be the woman in the will, hidden, nor the resilient grandmother that so many media outlets were looking for convert in symbol. For her, the true transformation was not a story that was told, but a way of being in her world. When some visitor asked him, as there was accomplished change so much, Margaret replied, "Always the same. I didn't make it. I just remembered." That phrase began to circulate, from mouth to mouth, like a mantra among those who had passed by her house. Even Amanda wrote it in one of his paintings, right at the foot of a portrait of Margaret in his porch, with a book in the hands. The painting was given to a young man who used to come each Wednesday and that finally decided move away to start over. "Take something that you remember what you are capable of doing," Margaret told him as she handed it to him. But not everything were happy endings. Some women they returned one and the other time with the same wound open. Others disappeared without leaving trail. And Margaret, although strong, it was not made of stone. There was nights in which the weight of so many stories he stole from others, he dream. In those, occasionally, he sat down in the kitchen, I lit a candle and opened his mother's diary. Return to those pages were like to talk to someone who understood without responding. "Dolores," he sometimes murmured, "I wish you would have had a place as this." He didn't say it with sadness, but with gratitude, because in some way, what his mother couldn't live, she was building. And on that invisible bridge between generations, Margaret felt accompanied, not by ghosts, but by an inheritance emotional that there was decided take and transform. An inheritance that was beyond measure in money, but in presence, in consolation, in dignity, recovered. One winter morning, Amanda arrived with a news unexpected. A small publishing house dedicated to stories royal women. They were read his story published months ago and wanted convert it in a book. "They say that history can inspire many more people if you count complete," she explained, her eyes twinkling. Margaret shook her head at first. "I don't want to be anyone's character," she said. But Amanda insisted, not with pressure, but with tenderness. "You've already are many things, Mom, but you can also be the written word, not to appear, to release." After think about it for days, Margaret accepted. They sat together for weeks, reviewing letters, photos, diary fragments, even messages from others women who had written thanking his existence. The process. It was painful because moments, but also healing. Amanda wrote, Margaret reviewed, and together they shaped a narrative intimate, honest, unadorned, neither martyrs. A story of reconstruction silent. The book was titled The Spark, underrated, and was published with a modest print run. I didn't expect becoming bestseller, but found his audience. Women, older people who thought they had nothing left to offer, young people who did not want repeat the silences of their mothers, daughters searching reconcile with their stories. The publisher organized a small presentation in the same library where Amanda had exhibited his paintings by first time. That one late week, Margaret stood up in front of a room full of faces, attentive, and said, "For many years I thought my life there was finished when they threw me out. But in reality, recently there started." It was the only phrase he said. He didn't do lack more. The applause was not noisy, but sincere. Amanda looked at her from the back of the room with tears contained, and Margaret smiled at her as only a mother who has recovered his place knows how to smile. Without words, but with all the soul. With the book published, they arrived new letters, not only from women, but also from older men, children repentant, and even granddaughters who read passages hidden in their school library. Margaret was surprised to discover as his history resonated further beyond his own world, but she didn't let that change her. She kept going to the market, taking care of his garden, reading under the same old tree. Fame passenger, she wasn't interested. When someone recognized her on the street and approached with enthusiasm, she responded with a smile, short, and returned to his routine. "I am not a celebrity," he said, "just a woman who did not disappear." In the deep down, Margaret knew that the real transformation was not there in his recognition external, but in have recovered the right to occupy a space without fear, to exist without apology, and that was what I stood for, with every gesture, every day. Meanwhile, Amanda blossomed into her own rhythm, sold the few objects that were there preserved from its ancient life with Chad, and moved into a rented cottage near his mother's. He painted, wrote, and gave workshops free for teenagers about self-esteem and expression artistic. Sometimes, Margaret attended as spectator silent. Watch her guide to others. Young people with sensitivity and firmness were like, see the seed of something that, although there was not germinated before, now grew strong. One afternoon, while as they walked home together, Amanda said to him, I figured we could be like this again." Margaret didn't respond immediately. She stopped, looked into her eyes and said, "I neither, but here we are." And they continued walking, with the golden light of the sunset wrapping their steps. At that moment, neither of them thought in what is lost, but in everything that still was left by live. Little by little, Margaret's house was transforming itself as well. Without losing his essence calm, it began to fill with small objects that counted stories. Drawings gifted by young people who passed by there, letters hanging as garlands in the kitchen, plants donated by neighbors grateful. It was not a decorated house by design, but by affection. Every corner had a meaning, and each object was a witness to a life shared. One of the walls of the hallway became in a kind of spontaneous mural, where Amanda hung phrases they heard or read together. One of Margaret's favorites was, "You don't need to be strong, all he time to be brave." I read it each time that happened by there as a reminder that your vulnerability there has also been his strength, and that I didn't have to prove anything to anyone. One day, he arrived a letter unlike any other. It was from a woman who claimed to have met Harold Sterling in his youth. He said that he spoke much of a daughter who could not name, and that he always regretted by it. The woman, already old woman, included a photo in black and white of Harold in front of a lake, with an envelope in hand. "This was for you, but he never knew as make you arrive that letter. He asked me to keep it, for someday you found." Margaret opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside, a letter with barely nails lines. "I was not brave. I didn't know how to fight by you. But I hope someday you will know that always tea I took with me." He didn't cry. He just closed eyes and held that leaf against his chest. I didn't need further explanations. I wasn't looking for redemption, but to feel that someone, even though lately there was recognized his place in he world, was a caress that I didn't know I had yet needed. That evening, Margaret left Harold's letter on the dining room table and stared at it. In silence, while took his herbal infusion, Amanda watched her from the other end without saying a word. He did not questions. He just walked over, stroked his mother's hand, and sat down next to her, sighed. Long minutes passed. Without speaking, accompanied by the dim lamplight and the soft creaking of the wood, when Amanda finally spoke, she just said, "I'm proud of you." Margaret smiled, not because courtesy, but from the depths of the soul. At that moment, he understood that it was not just about rebuilding broken links or fix the mistakes of the past. It was about having achieved a space of real love, built with visible scars, yes, but also with new ones, bricks, facts of respect, care and truth. With the time, Amanda proposed to him transform the house into something more than an informal refuge. "We can make this help more people, Mom, than what you created. Follow, even when you don't be here anymore." The idea was not easy to accept for Margaret, not for fear of death, but because implied to let out something intimate. But after thinking about it, she agreed. Together, they began to structure a small, formal, legalized project as foundation. They named it Casa Dolores in honor of their mother. It wasn't a shelter. Traditional, not even a help center with hours strict. It was a place of listening, of conversation, of community. The first volunteers were women who already had passed around the house, and the first contributions they came from small donations from neighbors, local artists, and readers of the book. It was not a project ambitious. He was, as Margaret said, so big as a conversation honest and a hot dish, and that, for many, was already a miracle. The Casa Dolores began to be known in a neighborhood as a place different. I didn't have signs flashy, nor social media campaigns, but always there was someone at the door. Sometimes they arrived women alone, others with children. Some were just looking speaker, others they needed a roof by a night. Margaret remained as guide discreet. She did not direct meetings, neither imposed rules. I was just present, with its serene look, and his voice paused. Amanda, in change, took a role. Further active, designed activities, artistic, organized writing workshops, and little by little it was shaping a space where the emotional had as much value as practicality. There was something special in that balance. Wisdom, Margaret's calm and energy. Amanda's renewed vision built a bridge between generations that had previously only known each other from the pain. One afternoon, while we're preparing soup for one dinner community, Amanda asked her mother if she regretted anything. Margaret thought during some seconds, with the spoon in the air. I have been silent for so long," he said. "Not about what I did or didn't do, but about what I didn't say, what I didn't ask for, what I allowed without knowing why." "What?" Amanda nodded, in silence. "But I also understand that I had to keep quiet to get here. Sometimes we don't talk because we have no words, and sometimes we don't have them because nobody else taught her how to use them." Amanda put down her spoon, walked over and hugged her. "Now you already know how to use them, Mom. And I'm learning thanks to you." They didn't cry. It was no longer missing. That one kitchen, with its smell, with garlic and bread, with the light of the sunset entering out the window, was the testimony that transformation is not always noisy. Sometimes it is a soup shared and a hug in time. With the arrival of spring, Casa Dolores began to receive student visits, university students, interested parties in do volunteering. Some they came by hours, others by weeks. They brought fresh ideas, energy, and above all, everything. One provision to learning that excited Margaret. One day, a young psychology student told him, never there was acquaintance to someone who spoke about pain with such calm down. Margaret laughed softly. It's that when no longer you scares, you can talk about him as who encounter old history. Those words became a kind of motto for the new ones volunteers, who they started to write phrases inspired by Margaret in a blackboard next to the entrance. As they passed day after day, that wall was filled with colors, messages and drawings that transformed the house into something more than a refuge. It had converted in a home, one where even the wounds they had permission to exist. One morning, while Amanda was organizing a workshop with teenagers, Margaret received a call unexpected. It was from a Foundation National dedicated to awarding projects community led by women over 55 years old. Someone, never knew who, had postulated the House of Dolores. They wanted to invite her to a ceremony in the capital and give him an award. Margaret hesitated. She never liked them, the stages, nor the medals, but Amanda insisted, "It's not just for you, Mum. It's for all those who crossed that door thanks to what you built." Finally accepted. They traveled together in bus, like two friends going on a hike. At the ceremony, when she was introduced, Margaret didn't give a speech. She just said, "I didn't come here to change he world. I came not to disappear. And in he I tried. I found many who also wanted continue here." The applause, it was long, but what I liked most remembered. It was Amanda's smile, sitting in front row, with eyes full of pride, silent. After that ceremony, life in the Dolores house continued as always. Simple, intense, true. Margaret kept her recognition on a shelf, among books and objects that for her they had more emotional weight than any trophy. Sometimes, the new ones, visitors were surprised to discover that the woman who greeted them with tea and biscuits was the same one who appeared in press articles or award ceremony videos. Margaret limited herself to shrug and say, "My worth is not there in what others come, but in what I am when nobody looks at me." That phrase, said without vanity, became in another favorite from the hallway mural. Amanda, by his part, continued expanding its activities. He achieved a scholarship to study art therapy and dreamed of opening a space creative permanent inside the house. Margaret watched her with tenderness and pride, knowing that she daughter Ratan, now it was a beacon for many further. Snap part T touched he heart. Subscribe to the channel to continue receiving stories, so don't let this spark goes out. With the passage of time, the anniversaries, they began to score key moments. The day Amanda returned to her door, the day they bought the house, the day they founded Casa Dolores. Each date was celebrated with something simple but significant. A dinner shared, one afternoon of reading, one round of stories under the patio lights. In one of those anniversaries, Amanda gave her mother a thick-covered notebook with paper recycled. In the first page, there was written, "So that never stop counting what matters." And Margaret started using it immediately. Not as a diary traditional, but as a kind of record of moments. A phrase heard in his garden, a story that moved her, a recipe that he remembered from his childhood. Writing it wasn't to be published. It was to remember what had happened, to have always present that each small history had a value that deserved to be kept with love. One summer afternoon, while sweeping the dry leaves from the yard, Margaret felt a slight dizziness. It didn't give him importance at first, but in the following days began to repeat themselves. Amanda took her to the doctor, insistent as never. After several studies, the diagnosis came with the crudeness of those who must say it many times a day, a slow but present. Margaret listened to him with the same calm with which there was faced so many other things in his life. He didn't ask how much time had, neither which were the odds. He just asked to know what I had to do to continue living with dignity. Amanda, in change, felt that the world was coming to him above, but this maybe he didn't run away. He cried, in silence in a hospital bathroom, dried face, and sat back down next to his mother with a notebook in hand. "Let's get organized," he said, "like you taught me." Margaret didn't want to disguise his state to the women of the house. He told it in an informal meeting with tea and biscuits, as so many others' conversations important. "I'm sick," she said, "but I'm not broken." He explained to them that he would continue over there while could, that Amanda would take further responsibilities, and that the Dolores house was not hers, but everyone's. There were tears, long hugs, promises of companionship, but above all everything, there was respect. No one treated Margaret like a victim. They followed her looking like the woman she was, firm, generous, and deeply human. With the time, the treatment, it began to wear her down. She lost some strength. She was getting tired further fast, and the garden afternoons became shorter, but their spirit remained intact. It remained listening stories, writing in his notebook, and remembering each person who passed by that door that still could choose who wanted to be, even in the midst of pain. In the middle of the treatment, Margaret began to prepare what she called his withdrawal calm. It was not pessimism, but clarity. Organized documents, left written letters, and recorded short audios with reflections that Amanda thought someday share at the Dolores house. Every step was taken without drama. Even he joked about it. "I want to leave as I lived this part of my life, with the control of my agenda." Amanda, although it hurt her deeply, she accepted her mother's wish. Together they selected photographs, put together a box with memories important, and wrote instructions detailed to keep the essence of the place alive. Margaret did not want the foundation to become a monument to his name. "This is not about me. It's about what can happen when a woman decides not to disappear." That phrase was written at the main entrance, right under the mural of phrases. One of the last things Margaret did was invite each one of the women who had passed for the house to leave a letter or an object, symbolic to save in a time capsule. The day it was sealed, it was organized a small ceremony, intimate in a garden. Amanda read a text she had written for his mother, where he said, "You weren't just born again, Mom. You taught us that all can do it." Margaret listened with her eyes closed and a soft smile. That one afternoon, the sunlight seemed further warm, like he knew that he was saying goodbye to something very precious. That night, Amanda helped her to go to bed. Margaret asked him for a grilled cheese sandwich and a cup of tea, like in their afternoon's calm. They ate in silence. Then, with voice very low, said, "I'm ready." Amanda didn't respond. She just took his hand, and in that gesture was left saying everything that one whole life there was no known say before. Margaret died 2 days later, in her home, surrounded by the things she loved. There was no sirens, nor hospitals, no dramatic farewells, just one evening calm, one breathing that died away noiselessly, and a candle lit beside her bed. Amanda was over there all heat time, holding her hand, whispering stories from the past as, his mother still could hear them. When everything had ended, he didn't cry right away. He stayed sitting at her side, in silence, like they used to do it in the afternoon tea parties. The house remained in calm, like understood that his foundress had just left. The women who lived or worked there, they met spontaneously in the room. There was no crying overwhelmed, neither speeches, only long hugs, glances shared, and one sensation unanimous that something very big and very beautiful had just closed. The funeral was simple, such as Margaret had ordered, no expensive flowers, neither masses prolonged. Amanda organized a ceremony in the patio of the house with colorful chairs, soft music, and a table full of the books and letters that his mother had collected. Every person who wanted to could read something, leave a letter, or simply feel in silence. Amanda read a fragment of the last his mother's notebook, where he wrote, "Don't remember me for what I lost, but for what I built when already nobody I bet by me." That phrase was left recorded at the entrance of the foundation. After the funeral, Amanda locked herself in by a few days. Not because I didn't know continue, but because needed stop, breathe, accept. When he came back out, he was wearing his same dress blue that Margaret used in that awards ceremony. "I'm ready," she said, echoing her mother's last words. And she knew that, from that moment on, legacy belonged to him. With the time, Amanda assumed by complete the management of the Casa Dolores. At first, the responsibility weighed on him, not because lack of capacity, but by his fear of not living up to what his mother had built. But he soon discovered that Margaret had not left a mold, but a seed, and that each decision that you made could nourish that legacy without needing to copy it. Modernized some spaces, expanded the workshops, added professionals, volunteers, and created a small library community with donations of everything he country. He did it to his way, but always remembering the essential, that this place was not to save anyone, but to accompany, listen, support. Margaret's phrases continued on the walls, the recipes in the kitchen, and its energy in each corner. One afternoon, one teenager who attended one of the art workshops approached her and said, "Are you Margaret's daughter?" Amanda nodded with a smile. The young woman replied, "Then you too must be strong." Amanda stayed thinking in that phrase a lot after the girl left. He understood that his strength did not come from having it made all good, but to have learned to continue even when he did wrong, like his mother, like so many others. That night, he took out the old notebook that Margaret used and wrote a single sentence, "The spark continue." The next day, he hung it up in the mural in the hallway. It was a message for all those who came with fear, with shame, with stories broken. But it was also a reminder for her same, because even when it seemed that everything had been off, always something was left on, something small, something persistent, something that never further would be underestimated again. This exciting, this history. So subscribe now and share this video with someone who also needs hope. The years they passed, and the Dolores House became in reference national, not by campaigns advertising, neither awards, eye-catching, but by the real effect it produced in who crossed his door. Some women, they arrived with nothing and left with everything: confidence, dignity, voice. Others returned time later, already with their lives rebuilt, to offer his help. Amanda was still in front, not like leader unquestionable, but as guardian of a story that followed writing all the days. In each activity, in each conversation, there was something of Margaret. Sometimes a gesture, sometimes a word, sometimes a silence. It was like, his presence would have been left floating between the walls, soft but firm, like a perfume that doesn't go away. In one of the commemorations annuals, Amanda prepared the exhibition with objects, personal details of his mother, his notebook, the Dolores' diary, photographs of her childhood, Harold's final letter. Beside each object, a small description written by Amanda, not in historical tone, but emotional. The sample was visited by hundreds of people, many of whom were leaving crying, others smiling, but all moved. At the end of the tour, there was a table where each visitor could write an anonymous note to someone important in his life. At the end of the event, Amanda read each paper. There was confessions, thanks, requests for forgiveness, and many phrases that said the same thing: "Thank you for not giving up." Amanda understood then that her mother's story wasn't just hers. It belonged to everyone, and that, even though Margaret was no longer physically, his existence would continue playing lives in forms that neither would be imagined. One day, while Amanda was checking a box, ancient that did not exist, open. Since the death of his mother, he found a recording in a small voice player. When he pressed play, he heard Margaret's voice, slow, firm, but with a tone warm that made her skin crawl. "If you're hearing this, probably I'm not here anymore. I didn't want to leave without leaving. You anything else? This voice, this way of telling you that I was in peace, that I did what I could, and that was enough, that you don't You demand so much, daughter. May you live calmly and know that nothing worthwhile born out of haste or fear. What you built with your hands, with your soul will continue, and not because they demand it from you, but because you know how to do it. I taught you to be strong. I showed that you could. Return to begin. Amanda cried uncontrollably, not out of sadness, but out of gratitude. He decided to digitize the recording and play it back in the anniversaries further close friends of the foundation. It was a way to bring Margaret back, not as icon, but as a mother, as guide, as real woman. Every time it rang that voice, the atmosphere was transformed. The women sat in silence, some with their eyes closed, others hugging each other. It didn't matter. Ye had known Margaret or not, all they felt that those words spoke to them directly. Amanda, from his place, I saw all with one mixture of emotion and serenity. Sometimes it seemed to him impossible that everything they lived had born of an evening broken, of 2 suitcases full of dignity wound, of a woman walking alone to a motel with no direction. But that's how it was. From the cracks further deep, there was something so luminous, so firm has emerged that nobody could deny his existence. The spark was still alive. With the years, Amanda wrote a second book, this time from his own voice. He titled it After the Silence. And although he spoke of many stories collections at the Casa Dolores, his axis was the transformation intimate, his own, his mother's, that of so many women who had learned to speak when before they only knew be silent. In the dedication wrote, "To my mother, Margaret, who taught me that silence can hurt, but it can also heal. Yes, we learn to use it with truth." The book, it was well received, especially in circles of women who were looking for inspiration further beyond the big speeches. Amanda did not convert in figure public, nor wanted repeat his mother's journey. His mission was another, to keep the fire without converting it in spectacle. Every time someone asked him, as there was accomplished, get over everything she lived through, he would answer without hesitation, I didn't get over it, I knitted it. We knitted it. In an interview, they asked him that I remembered with more Margaret's strength. Amanda stayed in silence some seconds, then smiled and said, "One rainy afternoon. We were eating grilled cheese sandwiches, no talking. There was turned recently, and she didn't judge me. She just served me tea and left me stay. That gesture changed my life." The journalist asked him, believed that her mother had forgiven. Amanda shook her head gently. "I didn't need to his sorry. I needed your presence, and I had it until the last day." That interview circled widely, and many readers they found in those words are something unexpected, a different form of reconciliation, one that doesn't depend on forgiveness. Grandiloquent, but the ability to look at each other with respect again, and that Amanda understood was the true Margaret's legacy, a way of being in a world without screaming, but without disappearing, never. Do you feel something reading this? Hit the subscribe button and join us in further stories, royals that leave fingerprint. As time went by, some of the young women who had found shelter in the Dolores house, they became new project leaders. Amanda began delegating further tasks, not by tiredness, but because I understood that everything legacy true needs, let go to grow. One of those young people, called Leah, there was arrived at the house with barely 17 years and one history of violence that had left almost voiceless. Years later, she was a psychologist. She led support groups and spoke with a serene conviction that reminded him of Margaret. One day during a planning meeting, Leah, he said, "We can't forget that this began because a woman refused to accept that they had discarded." Everyone nodded in silence. It was not just a phrase. It was a compass that followed, guiding each decision. Meanwhile, Amanda decided convert one of the rooms of the house in a small documentary archive, gathered recordings, letters, photos, mural phrases, books, underlines, objects symbolic, not as museum, but as living memory. Each visitor could walk through it, leave something of your own, or simply sit down to read. On one of the walls, framed with simple wood, was the first notebook page that Margaret started to write after your moving. I don't need Amanda's forgiveness to be complete. I just need remember who I am. That phrase became one of the center's emotional problems of the house. The women who arrived, many feeling guilty or broken, they found in those words one release unexpected. They were not there to be saved, nor to ask permission. They were there to remember who were, to be rebuilt from that place, and to take away that spark with him when decided leave. If you got here, maybe it's because you've also been a spark lit. Help more people find it. Subscribe to the channel. One day, an older woman with hair white and deeply sad eyes, he presented himself at the Dolores house with a letter in his hand. There was traveled over 1,000 kilometers just to leave that paper. Amanda received it, and before she could speak, the woman, he said, I went to unrecognized daughter, but never I had the courage to seek my story until I read Margaret's. They sat together in the patio, under the shade of a tree that Amanda had planted the day her mother died. The woman did not ask help nor accommodation. I just wanted to say thank you. Before leaving he left the letter in a file keen next to others, so many that already formed part of the soul of the place. Amanda walked her to the door, and they said goodbye with a long hug without needing many words. Sometimes true consolation is not there in solving, but in to know understood. That night, Amanda reviewed the letter. The woman he recounted as there was vivid all his life, believing himself to be invisible, nameless, placeless. He said that discovering Margaret's story gave him permission to wonder by first time, what if, do I deserve more too? Amanda closed the eyes and felt a wave of emotions. He understood then that his mother's story had not only served to heal his link or to lift a foundation, there was open cracks in many others' lives, allowing the light to enter where before there was only darkness. It wasn't fame, it wasn't glory, it was impact, true, deep, silent. And in that silence, Amanda found the echo of something that had time in voice of his mother. The world does not always need noise. Sometimes you just need to remember it. With the years, Amanda became a beloved figure in the community, not for have founded nothing, but by have consistently maintained what her mother started. They saw her in the market, in the workshops, watering her garden of the Casa Dolores, with the same calm with which her mother served tea. There was aged with dignity, without haste, without disguises, and, although he had no children, many called her Mom Amanda or Aunt, in that language spontaneous that is born when someone becomes in shelter. Sometimes they asked him if I didn't feel loneliness. She responded naturally, loneliness is not always absence. Sometimes it is space, and in this space fit many stories. In his room continued hanging he portrait that Amanda painted of her mother so many years ago in the back, the one in the rocking chair and the one book. I looked at it each night before sleeping. It was his prayer, his route. One afternoon, while classified papers ancient found a loose sheet of paper written for Margaret, who never there was read. It was brief. If one day they ask who I went, don't say I went strong. Say I was human, that I had fear, that I fell, that I doubted, but that even so I chose continue. Amanda stayed sitting with that leaf on her lap during a lot time, and he decided that precisely that would be what would be transmitted always. Because Margaret wasn't a heroine unattainable. It was a woman who fell apart and put herself back together, who didn't wait for a rescue, but rescued herself. That humanity was her greatest legacy. And Amanda understood, with each story that came, with each woman knocking on the door, who while that if the truth were kept alive, the spark would never go out. Never. Years further afternoon, in anniversary number 20 of the Dolores house, Amanda organized a ceremony simple. There was no press, nor guests famous, Only women who had passed around the house, the volunteers current, and some new generations that already they listened to speak of Mrs. Margaret as a legend. They met in the patio, between warm lights and homemade food. Like always, Amanda spoke at the end. She didn't read Nun's speech. He only said, "My mother did not come into the world to beg. She came to remember who he was, and we taught everyone to do the same." Then he asked for a minute of silence. It wasn't sad, it was profound, a silence full of respect, gratitude, and promises new. When finished, the women they released into the air papers with Margaret's handwritten quotes. It was a tribute without monuments, a celebration, intimate of something that was still alive. When Amanda returned home alone that night, he prepared a grilled cheese sandwich and a cup of tea. He sat down. In his rocking chair, the same as a time painted in that painting. In front of her, the Margaret's portrait seemed to look at her tenderly. Amanda closed eyes and smiled. He didn't feel nostalgic. He felt fullness. Not everything there was been perfect. Not everything there was been fair, but there was been true. He remembered every step of that story, the expulsion, the motel, the diary, the letter, the house, the foundation, the hugs, the losses. All of that was in she, woven with invisible threads that now formed his identity. And it was at that time, in that night without noise, without witnesses, that Amanda understood the essential. Margaret was not fire off. It was the spark they underestimated. And that spark, which one day seemed small and lonely, there was lit a fire that never more would become extinct. Snap History meant something to you, don't you? Don't go without subscribing. It's our way of knowing it's worth it. Continue counting stories as this,